Dear friends, over the last week we have been watching in horror as the situation in the Middle East has once again devolved into armed conflict. As Hamas rockets fly over Israeli cities, targeting, killing, and terrorizing Israeli citizens, IDF missiles have in turn rained down on rocket launching sites in Gaza and leveling buildings containing high-ranking Hamas militants, weapons caches, and meeting places, costing innocent Palestinian civilians their lives as well, having been shamefully and egregiously used by Hamas as human shields. As I prepare this message, news is now breaking that Israel is sending ground troops into Gaza, bringing us to the brink of all-out war. Let us make no mistake. The Palestinian narrative points to justifiable grievances over a situation that could have and should have been handled far better by Israel in the interests of peace and coexistence. But while the context of this latest escalation is very important to understand and deserves to be discussed and resolved in good faith, it remains forefront in the minds of Jews and supporters of Zionism around the world that Hamas has never needed a reason to attack Israel, and only eagerly justifies their aggression by invoking whatever pretext seems most convenient at the time. They do it in order to galvanize support from average Palestinians and distract them from the reality that it is really them, Hamas, whose actions are really to blame for the vast majority of Palestinian suffering, persecution, and death. Israel, now, as always, deserves our unwavering support. Under no circumstances should Israel be forced to tolerate weapons attacks on its citizens or its sovereignty, and has every right to exert the force necessary to protect itself from this and any existential threat. Now, as always, Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, and Zionism is, has always been, and will always be, the rightful claim that we, the Jewish people, deserve self-determination in our native ancestral homeland, realizing the dreams of generations of Jews before us who prayed facing east, declaring at the end of every Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem, and the completion of the journey home that began so long ago in the desert of Sinai. This week, as an expression of support for Israel, in my video Dvar Torah this week, we will connect the dots, drawing a continuous line from our exodus from Egypt to our return to the Middle East and the founding of the modern state of Israel. This week we begin reading the fourth book of the Torah, Bamidbar. In English we call this book Numbers, but literally translated, Bamidbar means in the desert. Now begins the 40-year journey which would eventually see the people of Israel safely to the banks of the Jordan River, back to the land first settled by Abraham and the birthplace of Isaac and Jacob. The people of Israel now number just over 600,000, divided into 12 tribes, named for the sons of Jacob. They are Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zevulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Binyamin, Ephraim, and Menashe. True, that's 13 tribes, and those last two are actually not sons of Jacob, but grandsons. But then the tribe of Levi is not considered a tribe because they weren't allotted any land in ancient Israel. Just Google it, you'll get the idea. When they reach the promised land, they conquer it from the Canaanites, who were not themselves a unified people with a national identity, but just a collection of tribal entities who had migrated to the region from North Africa and who no longer exist today. Each tribe of Israel settles in a different part of the region of Canaan, and eventually they unify under a single monarchy, King David, becoming the unified kingdom of Israel. This lasts until the line of succession comes under dispute, and the kingdom of Israel fractures into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the combined tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, which became the kingdom of Judea. The term Jew is simply the anglicized term for Judean, which is just a Romanized term for the Hebrew word Yehudim, which just means of the tribe of Yehuda. What happened to all the other Israelites from the other tribes, you ask? Ask the Assyrians, who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BCE. Ever heard of the 10 lost tribes? There they are, and there they go. Jews today are the Judeans, who had absorbed the tribe of Benjamin along with many thousands of refugees from the other tribes who managed to escape the Assyrians in the north. Later, in 586 BCE, the kingdom of Judea was itself conquered by the Babylonians, and half the Jews were sent into exile only to be allowed to return 20 years later when the Babylonians were, in turn, conquered by the Persians, who, as it happens, were nice enough to help finance the building of the Second Temple. Thanks, Persia. Jews in Judea were allowed to continue to self-govern under Persian rule, and then under Greek rule until the story of Hanukkah, when Judeans fought the Greeks and became independent once again, only to end up becoming a vassal state to the growing Roman Empire. To clarify for our Christian and Muslim friends, Jesus was not Palestinian, he was Judean. Then finally, in 70 CE, the Romans destroyed Judea, and as a further insult to the Jews, renamed it Syria Palestina for their ancient mortal enemies, the Philistines. If the Romans destroyed Israel today, it would be the same as if they renamed it Hitlerland just to rub it in. Some Jewish slaves were taken to Rome, who would eventually move on to Spain and Germany, becoming the Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews who spread through the western and eastern parts of Europe, respectively. And while the largest population of Mizrahi Jews had been living in Babylon since the first exile, they too had spread throughout the Middle East, always still maintaining a presence in Syria Palestina. After the fracturing of the Roman Empire and the rise of Islam, the province of Syria Palestina changed hands frequently through the Middle Ages between the Christian Byzantines and the various Muslim regimes, eventually being conquered by the Turks, who grew into the Ottoman Empire, and maintained control over the region until its collapse after World War I. The region was assigned to Britain in 1920 at the San Remo Conference, who called it the British Mandate for Palestine, which at the same time also included pretty much the whole territory we now call the country of Jordan. And after being terrorized, demonized, dehumanized, and massacred through Europe in the Holocaust, Jews began to return en masse to their essentially barren ancestral homeland, somehow finding the strength to rebuild. The British withdrew, and the State of Israel was reborn. Throughout all of time, there was never such a place as a country called Palestine. It was inhabited by peoples of all kinds, occupied by almost every major empire in history, but never once, since the time of Moses, was it a place that did not have a Jewish presence. Whether we call ourselves Jews, Judeans, Yehudim, or even Palestinians, which is what Jews living in the region prior to 1948 actually called themselves, we are forever bound through our religion, our language, our culture, and our heritage to the land of Israel and to each other. For this reason, Jews around the world stand up for Israel together as one, now and forever. Shabbat Shalom. Am Yisrael Chai.